So, welcome everyone to the Undergraduate Research Education Series. Welcome back if you've ever been here before. My name is Shriver. I organize this series. I work in the Office of Undergraduate Research. Very excited that you all are able to join us on Zoom today. I'm going to start with just two things, land acknowledgement, and then we will also talk about attendance and just kind of some housekeeping stuff. And then we will get to the actual content that you all are here for. Unsettling settler words, images, and ideas, settler murals, and settler archives from Dr. Romeo Garci. Okay, so the American Indian Resource Center leads the way for me to acknowledge that the land that the University of Utah resides on has always been on indigenous land, specifically on the lands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. I encourage you all to think about the indigenous peoples of whatever land you're currently on if you are not also in Salt Lake City. It's imperative that we acknowledge the enduring relationship that exists between indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. Through this land acknowledgement, I want to express my personal gratitude and appreciation for their perseverance to protect this land for future generations. The erasure of this relationship between indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands is an insidious form of ongoing colonization, and we need to build our mindfulness of this and other indigenous protocols. And of course, in my opinion, the first step and best way to respect indigenous peoples would be to give the land back. Okay, for housekeeping, if you have logged into the Zoom call in real time right now, your attendance has already been recorded. You don't have to do anything else to get that checked off. If you are watching this video later for your attendance requirement for any of the summer research programs, please go to the top of the Education Series page and fill out that Undergraduate Research Education Series evaluation form with your unit. That is the only way that I can know that you watched the video for your attendance. Okay, and with that, Dr. Garcia.
Thank you, Shriver. So should I share my screen first, right? I should, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Share a screen. And then, okay. So thank you everyone for being here. I greatly appreciate it. I hope everyone's summer has been going well as it can go. And, you know, I appreciate Shriver and company for inviting me to do this talk. So my name is Romeo Garcia, assistant professor in the Department of Writing and Rhetoric Studies. I teach and research about the relationship between power, its literacies, images, and rhetorics, and its consequences. My inquiry focuses on the role literacies, rhetorics have and continue to play in constructing settler states, constituting hunted communities, and maintaining wounded spaces and places. I typically rely upon settler archives as a powerful medium of and for this work. Today, the title of my presentation is Unsettling Settler Words, Images, and Ideas, Settler Murals, and Settler Archives. It is a typical presentation I might give in a course I teach and say on the rhetorics and narrativizations of and on settler arrival. So I created this fancy presentation, so I hope it goes well. You see, okay. So a couple of years ago, my family and I visited Long Beach for the first time. Once you cross the Astoria Megler Bridge and make a left on 101 North, there's a small sign with red lettering that tells you the land is Chinook and that it has not been ceded. Upon seeing that, I started Googling everything related to Chinook. I'm a Googler, and I believe, by the way, that our everyday chance encounters and experiences are all learning opportunities. Eventually, we took a right at the intersection between 101 Alt and 101 South. Sorry, I need to get with the slide transitions. So There's Astoria, and then the bridge to Long Beach. At the stop sign and on the right side, there was another visual. We did not know what to expect as first-time visitors, but I surely was intrigued by what we had already or witnessed to before arriving to Long Beach. I could not help but put into practice all the things my grandma taught me many years ago. I spent a lot of time with her in my youth, and she's very relevant to the work that I do today. She used to say to me things like, ¿Qué ves? Or what do you see? ¿Qué oyes? Or what do you hear? ¿Entiendes? Do you understand? Te digo esto para que sepas y aprendes. I tell you this so you know and you learn. And I contemplated these statements as I encountered the following images. I contemplated, or today my analytical and pedagogical work is informed by those material exchanges. Today I work to remain recognizable to such. Honoring that, I would like to ask you, and since we're virtual, I know many of y'all can't respond, but what do you see across the three photographs included? And I'd like you to take some time to really look at what you're saying. We see people in a boat in the water, but who are those people? And what sound does the image make? I know that is an awkward question to ask, but images do make a sound and communicate to us a message. Perhaps here it is the sound of arrival and the message of settlement. We see an encounter of sorts, the bottom image to the left, but between whom? Between settlers and original inhabitants of the land. And again, what sound does the image make? A sound of a peaceful encounter, it would seem. We see an individual utilizing the land and oceanscape as a resource. The area remains known for their razor clams and Willapa Bay oysters. The murals all seem innocent, but let us recall the sign mentioned earlier. It tells us something we should understand. ¿Entiendes? This is Chinook land, and it has not been ceded. It tells us this so we know, para que sepas, that the domination, management, and control of lands by settlers were not inconsequential to their people. It tells us this so we learn, para que emprendes, that the domination, management, and control land, quote unquote, resources, knowledge, and even being continues to persevere. That sign makes a sound and communicates a message. What is the US and its settler states, if not settler colonialism, coloniality, and modernity coloniality persevering? I'll tease out these terms further and illustrate where they are at, how they have worked, and how they continue to inflict upon our story so far today. For now, regarding Long Beach, this is the end for that, but I plan to return to this work in the near future. The settler project of domination, management, and control, and the system of ideas, images, and ends that hold it together were never intended to end. In recent years in my field, some have dedicated their work to investigating those. Scholars in settler colonial studies would tell us settler colonizers arrived and stayed and engaged in structural invasion. That is a linchpin argument. Territory and territoriality are settler colonialism's ends. We can understand settler colonialism as the interplay between domination, destruction, replacement, and management control. What this interplay tells us is that settler colonialism was not an event, but rather a structure. This structure relies upon a triad of human projects: the erasure and or invisibilizing of people, the making of land as property and resources, and the treatment of certain beings as dispensable. Scholars in the modern colonial collective tell us coloniality is a logic of domination, management, and control, working through various domains of human experience. And we know these domains, right? The political or control of authority and power, the economic, or appropriation of land and racial distribution and exploitation of labor, the civic, or the control of things such as gender and sexuality, and the control of the epistemic, or control of knowledge and being. They also tell us the world as we know it today is a modern colonial one, which for them means that every time we hear the projects or the narratives of salvation, progress, development, there is the logic of coloniality already working through it. Each of these terms, settler colonialism, coloniality, and modernity coloniality, have the idea of race, epistemic racism, and the idea of management and control working in and at its core. I noted earlier that the Chinook sign makes a sound and communicates a message. What is the US and its settler states if not settler colonialism, coloniality, modernity coloniality, persevering? This would suggest that settler colonialism, coloniality are not unique to the US. It would also suggest they are somewhat of institutions architected and left behind. Now, in order for them to persevere, everyday people must do certain things that belong to practices that surround the making and remaking of those institutions. Those institutions reflect beliefs, principles, and worldviews. For those institutions to persevere, that would mean that there was an idea, and that this idea acted as a foundation, first for an argument, and then a system of arguments to appear and become consequential. Words and ideas, I believe, can and do make place. There's a system of ideas, images, and ends that hold together settler colonialism. That is the second point that I would like to make. The third is that there's an institution, or that there is an association of social interests. Everyday people are the effective channels of rhetorical transmission of and for this system. These institutions situate us squarely on wreckage, the appropriation of lands, the extrication and exploitation of land as a resource, and destruction of indigenous populations. But it also situates us squarely on the question of epistemology and epistemic issues, as well as the role literacy, semiotics, and rhetorical work have played. The abstract for this session notes we will consider the utility of rhetorical, ecological, and decolonial framework, perspective, and lens. Settler colonialism, coloniality are complex terms and concepts. That they require literacy and rhetorical work is almost common sense. Yet in my line of work, we cannot take the relationship as common sense. In doing so, we fail to observe the complexities, tease out the particularities, and understand the specificities in which they work. So I ask, what role has haunted literacies, images, and rhetorics played in constructing settler states, in constituting haunted communities, and in maintaining wounded spaces and places? Now, I'm new to ecological rhetorics, but not new to the consequences of those institutions. I was born and raised in a part of Texas, separated from Mexico by the geopolitical border to the south, and separated from the interior parts of Texas by internal checkpoints 70 miles north of the border. Here, the colonial traffics in the Normandy. And here the story goes, US citizens as white European descendants being protected from the quote unquote Mexican, not through direct colonization, but through coloniality. It is a geography of exclusion. I refer to it as a bordered land. And the suffix of ed is less about achieving some rhetorical effect and more about making visible the real and haunted literacies, images, and rhetorics of borders and boundaries that discursively contain and monitor our everyday lives. I would venture to argue that none of us are really new to the ecological consequences of those three institutions. All across the Americas and the US, settlers have manufactured an image of empty landscapes from which inhabiting bodies vanish and or disappear. This has allowed settlers to produce an excessive image of themselves as saviors of the world, destined to discover, to recover, to transform the land vis-a-vis projects of salvation, progress, and development. And the consequences have and continue to be the colonization of land, people, knowledge, understanding, and being. In the state of Utah, any of us have to do is drive through Temple Square or visit This Is the Place Heritage Park, or even be a general resident of Utah, and we encounter these very ideas, images, and ends. In such spaces, we are reminded states such as Utah were not discovered, but invented. The idea of Utah tells us more about settler inventions that it is always already a self-serving narrative. So I ask, what role has haunted literacies, images, and rhetorics played in constructing a landscape either waiting to be discovered or up for grabs to be saved and owned, in constituting land as resources, awaiting extraction and exploitation, and in maintaining that certain people are dispensable either by divine and or natural design? Now, I see myself as part of this collective of decolonial work, and I utilize a specific framework, right? The modernity coloniality framework. And the central thesis here is that the darker side of settlement and modernity has and continues to be coloniality. The project of modernity decoloniality has two tasks, the analytic and the perspective. And within the analytic, the goal is to confront, to unveil, to unsettle, and decolonize the production of settler words, images, and ideas. So much of my work investigates how everyday actor agents have rhetorically sold and imported, purchased and shared in, and expanded under disputed this system of images, ideas, and ends. So here I ask, and this is my third one, what role has literacies, images, and rhetorics played in constructing a hegemonic architecture of knowledge and understanding, in constituting universal knowledge and understanding, and in maintaining this architecture as a universal standard for producing knowledge? So in building out our rhetorical, ecological, and decolonial lens, we should all be asking, where is coloniality at? Who are knowing subjects? What are knowing subjects saying and doing? What is their locus of enunciation? How were those epistemic spaces architected and left behind, meant to promote and reproduce ideals and support and defend posterity? The university functions as one of those spaces, by the way. One possible medium, both for grounding specificities and particularities of the consequences of settler colonialism, are archives. But what are archives and why are archives? So throughout the semester, when I teach my students, we focus on this question. Archives collect information about places, subjects, and their events, but they are so much more too. Each scholar mentioned on this slide makes a series of important arguments. Archives are understudied. Archives are dynamic sites of rhetorical power. Archives tell a story. Settler archives, can provide a window into the making and remaking of settler colonialism. They can ground for us the specificities and particularities of where it is and how it works. My inquiry into settler archives has been as much about the ideas and inventions of Texas and the lower Rio Grande Valley and Utah and Salt Lake City as it is an analysis and decolonization of the history of lies and performative contradictions and the role theology and secularism have played in producing hegemonic power. Settler archives create an interplay between the visible context for colonization and the context for decolonization. And archives are not going to change, but why and how we approach them can. They can become a powerful medium for the decolonial agenda. So at this point, I'm going to move on to actual sites, so Texas and Utah. So the project was never intended to end. In Texas, the idea Texas was the last frontier in which only certain beings possessed the abilities to wrestle the land away from its state of wilderness is very strong. I'm reminded of my home. The future has at last arrived in the valley. In 2022, it was announced Amazon was building in McAllen, Texas. And the headline reads, Amazon warehouse brings opportunities to the valley. In 2014, Elon Musk and his commercial space company set its eyes on Boca Chica, Texas, and began purchasing tracts of land. In the valley, we say we are behind in everything from opportunities in employment to higher end restaurants to quality education. But the future has at last arrived. But at what cost? Elon Musk, for me, is the modern day Lon C. Hill or John Sherry of the Valley. Those names are all unfamiliar to y'all, but I'll return to them in a bit, but I want to continue with Musk just for a little bit longer. His efforts to establish and expand Starbase is notable for his literacies, images, and rhetorics utilized. Like early settlers, Musk produces an image about the land. We've got a lot of land with nobody around, he tweets. He also engages in settler advertisement. Please consider moving to Starbase or greater Bronzeville, South Padre area in Texas and encourage friends to do so, he also tweets. Now, by friends, Musk means non-local regional people. Gus Boba's Texas Observer's article, Border and Immigration, offers insight into the mindset of those who Musk attracts. A Kentucky man is quoted saying, it's like 530 years ago, the last time we settled a new world. So here's the tweet exchange. You can see it on the slide, but that I quoted already on the top, and then at the bottom, a person named Jessica says, I love it. The property waited many, many years for y'all to find it, right? So there you have, again, this rhetoric of discovery that is very essential to past and current settlers. So these are some of the archival materials that I've worked with in the past and that I continue to come back to. A great movement south to bring civilization to the wilderness occurred in the late 1800s and early 1900s in Texas. Harlingen was seen as one of the last, quote unquote, frontiers to conquer, described as a, quote, floundering community buried in mud that was raw, rough, and underdeveloped. In one of these pamphlets here that you can see, it says, pioneers came and conquered. They took on the spirit of their forefathers and worked to turn the city into the pivot city around which tremendous development would amaze the nation. Settlers of Harlingen celebrated the idea that unlike other settlers who squatted on stolen land, they settled on free land with no Spanish background, which bolstered their claim that they were men of integrity, men who left the records for posterity to read. But we know that not to be true. They recognized and acknowledged there were a few settlements that existed, but they were, it was argued, simply clusters of jackals and not examples of civilization. With the arrival of settlers and settlements of the valley came the first real estate men and the land and title companies, such as Launcie Hill Improvement Company and the Southwestern Land Company. Such real estate men and land and title companies advertised to other settlers that the valley was and would become settler land built by and for settlers. Settlers turned to what I will refer to as settler advertisements to reach settlers across the world, to extend an invitation to other settlers. Here, they all competed for the prospect of those settlers. Come to Harlingen. Mercedes is different from and better than any other town in the valley. And they describe cities with enticing appeals. The land of heart's delight, the land of opportunities, the promised land. To narrativize how they would overcome nature, they use these advertisements. And they would say, nature's crowning gift to man disguised, hidden as but nature can, disguised in desert garb complete, now lies waiting at our feet. Almost poetic. And they also use settler advertisements to narrativize progress. The valley, they wrote, community bears an unmistakable stamp of modernness and progressiveness. And they use those advertisements to narrativize development as well. No section of the United States is undergoing more solid development than the valley, they wrote. And they use these advertisements to tout grandiose claims. They claimed, for example, that the progress and development ongoing in the valley was unparalleled in the history of the nation. But their invitations to settlers was not meant to be an inclusive invitation. Again, when settlers referred to the valley as a newly discovered country, they made clear the difference between settlers and the kinds of beings, quote unquote, usually found in new countries. When Sherry spoke of a splendid moral people, or when Hill spoke of men of vision, they meant people like them, settlers, imbued with proper intelligence and spirit, who, quote, vision the future and the success which has attended their efforts in building a modern city. When settler advertisements spoke of citizens, they were meaning the sons of valorous men who heeded the call of the treasure land, sons whom emulate the deeds of their fathers, other settlers. The citizens of the valley celebrated their accomplishments. And in that middle image, you can see the document that I'm about to speak about. Harlingen, gateway to the valley, wants you. They describe Harlingen as a spot on a railroad map. It continues with making note of its progress. Today, a modern city in the center of the richest, most productive, and most thickly populated agricultural region of the United States. It has passed, the booklet reads, the pioneering and experimental stages. The story of Harlingen, the booklet reads, is a story of a city at the heart of the world's most fertile region that continues to enjoy growth and prosperity. Here we observe a description meant to center both a place of productive resources and certain bodies as the center of space and the present of time. So I might, get some criticism for this, but the Settler Project never came to an end in Utah either. So I'm going to play a quick clip, and this is at the inauguration of President Taylor RANDALL. He had this to say, and let's see if we can hear it.
A university. And when I reimagine something, I form a mental image that becomes so powerful that it looks like a future that becomes so inspiring, so innovative, so impactful that it unifies an organization around an aspirational ideal. I instinctively think about a future that is better than what we have now. I imagine a future that inspires, a future that innovates, and a future with enormous impact. The time to reimagine our university is right now. Why is that? Because we stand at the precipice of an enormous opportunity. Perhaps an opportunity that has not faced us since our pioneer forebears looked at a blank piece of land and said, we're going to build a university there.
So that last part is really the part that I want us to pay attention to. Like Musk, President Randall produces an image of empty landscapes from which the inhabiting bodies of the other have vanished and or disappeared. Again, words and ideas can and do make and take place. So I'm going to condense what I have to say about church settler archives in Salt Lake City to condense it a little bit so that way we can get to the conversation. Sorry. And here I want to focus on the Book of Mormon, right? It lays out a relationship between the descendants of Nephi and the descendants of Lamech. Nephites are described in Book of Mormon as men of truth and soberness, endowed with divine and natural rights to carry out work. And that work is salvation, re-education, conversion, restoration. And it is on the behalf of the Lamanites. Invented as contrary to and different than the Nephites are the Lamanites, considered per divine and natural design a cursed people whose baseness is not correct. They carry a mark or a skin of scales, of darkness, blackness, symbolizing their curse for acts of transgressions. Lamanites are described in the Book of Mormon as wild and naked wanderers and threats by their nature of their ferociousness and idolatry. Any interaction in the Book of Mormon is confined to salvation, re-education, conversion, and restoration, so that the Lamanite could become a white and delightsome people again. And any resistance to their own salvation and conversion could and was argued as justifiable in terms of violence. When we read the Book of Mormon close, it is an account of everyday projects of territorial and epistemological expropriation. The Book of Mormon becomes the foundation, I believe, for a civil, social, racial, and political design to appear and become consequential beyond its immediate setting and context. And church settlers of the 19th century would apply then an exegesis and eisegesis approach to the Book of Mormon. They saw themselves in the image of Nephites and thus sought to translate both the racialized relations and the work of salvation in the Book of Mormon to their everyday. Church settlers argued that their religious persecution was unparalleled across space and time. I'm reminded of William Clayton's hymn, "Come, Come, Ye Saints." The hymn registers and settles the idea church settlers were peaceful, persecuted, and exiled. None shall come to hurt or make afraid, it says. And that they were forced to seek refuge or asylum on what is and was their promised lands. Quote, "We'll find the place which God for us prepared far away in the west." And guided by Brigham Young, church settlers would discover, arrive in, settle, and work towards architecting the Great Salt Lake Valley in the image, narrative, and rhetoric of church settlers in 1847. And this is where the Journal of Discourse becomes an important resource in my classroom and the work that I do. It is a 26-volume archive of sermons and doctrinal instruction transcribed and published between 1851 and 1886. Upon discovering Utah, they relied, church settlers, on haunted literacies, images, and rhetorics to produce images of empty landscapes from which the inhabiting bodies of the other have vanished or disappeared. Knowing subjects spoke of Utah in two ways. First, as a place that had not been, quote, beheld by a, quote, man upon the face of the earth, but Utah was not empty. Church settlers were forced to confront that reality. And in so doing, they turned to and translated the literacies in Book of Mormon into their everyday. Quote, "We are here in the mountains with these Lamanites." The quote unquote Indian invented and reduced by church settlers to things of mere nature or deemed dispensable by divine and natural design were not considered as man. So when church settlers question, why are these Lamanites living upon the reptiles of the earth? When they made observations that the Lamanite Indian lived in a natural state as beasts of the field, or when they appealed to the general public as asylums amongst the red savages, we observe everyday human projects of territorial and epistemological expropriation. The second way church settlers spoke of Utah was a place that, quote, scientific men and, quote, travelers had declared worthless. Knowing subjects observed upon discovering Utah, quote, dead grass, desolate waste, a parched and barren desert, a place nobody would live upon. When church settlers argued, quote, no civilized people or class of people had inhabited Utah, the quote unquote Indian invented and reduced, again, were not considered as beings. Both ways of speaking of Utah allowed knowing subjects to proclaim Utah as the central place of gathering and the center stake of Zion. Oh, sorry, I was behind on slides again. So church settlers understood and referred to Mormonism as a system. Now, that's their own words, right? A great chain of existence, they wrote, or genealogy was advanced among church settlers. I'm sorry, am I good on time? Okay. This was constituted by, quote, pre-existence. Quote, we had a pre-existence. As tethered to works of God, pre-existence explained to them why some had certain rights and privileges, while others carried a mark of a curse. For them, this explained why they were endowed with such intellect. In posing and answering the question, what is our nature? Church settlers argued Mormonism and Mormons on all truths and every principle of true philosophy was right in principle, in doctrine, and in precepts. They credit this to a divine and natural design of propriety. According to church settlers, God organized different grades and classes of the human family. For them, God had also organized intelligent and unintelligent beings in places of thought and non-thought. In both arrangements, God, church settlers claim, favored them above any other class and people upon the earth. They also claim God had given to such people greater ability to manage and to control. Their propriety would be constituted by the privileges of both coming to understanding and of walking in the light. Church settlers relied on theology and secularism to rear, quote, a superstructure, as they called it, known as Mormonism. And they had a global and planetary aspiration. Quote, we are not coping with a few people here and there, but with the world. That is Mormonism. They saw themselves as destined to, quote, aid in the enlightenment of the world and to, quote, save people wrapped up in the superstitions and false traditions. 174 years later, near and far, their institutions continue to support and defend posterity and promote and reproduce ideal representations of knowledge, understanding, and being. Today, the church continues to engage in everyday human projects of territorial and epistemological expropriation, vis-a-vis the work that they interpret as their own. So, man, I am really behind on slides. I am sorry. So this was what I was quoting earlier in the talk. Look around upon all the ranks of mankind and we see different races, some of a high order of intellect and some low and groveling among all the different grades and classes of the human family. So that's Journal of Discourses again. So this is my last slide. The US and its settler states such as Texas and Utah are examples of what had arrived and was established in the Americas in the 15th and 16th century. But the Americas is for another day. But my argument would stay the same. We cannot come to terms with settler colonialism, coloniality, nor modernity coloniality without coming to terms with its literacies, images, and rhetorics. Settler archives can help facilitate the work of countering the idea of race and a logic of domination, management, and control in and through stories and memories that both persist some 500 years later. Says something important, by the way, and we're talking about settler colonialism, coloniality, that even as power changes hand, and we know that to be true, the idea of race and the idea that some people are in a position to dominate, management, and control, those two ideas have remained intact, meaning that there is an association of social interests, rhetorically selling and importing, purchasing and sharing in, and expanding and disputing a system of ideas, images, and ends. That, in a nutshell, is Western imperialism. Eurocentrism, in this way, is not necessarily a question of geography or necessarily a geographical issue, but of epistemology and epistemic issues. In the part of Texas I am from, we have a saying, para los que sepan, for those who know. None of us are unaffected from any of this. And I tell you this, as my grandma would say, so you know, and so you learn. And so if this was a regular, class, I would say, throughout the entire rest of the semester, we'll be dedicating our time, reading these archives, encountering the settler words and ideas, and then working to unsettle those and figure how those histories continue to traffic